Welcome back to Reform Millennials, a podcast where we discuss the intersection of markets, politics, and pop culture. Please remember that the content of this show is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Nothing should be considered financial or tax advice. Please consult a professional before you make any investment decisions.
Good morning, Joel. How's it going?
Pretty darn good. Sitting here in Toronto, enjoying my room here. You know what? We've done this fourth show, and I have not been home for any but the first. So hopefully get back to normal here next month.
Just a jet setter. Well, you've actually also never been in your very nice office at your home, which I'm not jealous of a lot of things, but I am jealous of your home office. It's a great spot to do podcast and work.
Adriana did a bang up job setting that up for me.
Her taste is impeccable, of course.
Yes, especially in guys. But yeah, no, it's been a wild couple of weeks. I know for sure it's been crazy for you. So let's jump into, I don't know, do you want to touch on the government shutdown, or should I do a little market recap first?
So we could do a little market recap first. It's fine. And then I'll get into shutdown, and then we'll get into talking about gold. We have a whole plan for today. We're so prepared.
Yes, so prepared. So over the last couple of weeks, we've seen markets kind of go sideways. They've been digesting what is arguably one of the greatest stock runs in the history of the stock market. So from the March, April lows through to the end of August, early September, we had one of the lowest volatility runs in stocks in probably a decade. And as a result of that, markets tend to have to digest those moves. And right now, momentum stocks are pulling back. So what are those? Your quantum computing, nuclear space, drones, rare earth metals, robots, crypto, AI, all of that has fallen into a 10 to 40% pullback, depending on which one of those sectors you focus on. Momentum stocks are generally a precursor to what might happen in the general market moving forward. And right now we've seen a digestion, or we're experiencing a very range-bound, choppy move. I think that this is, or most people will try to figure out why. And they'll look at whether it be especially in bank stocks, you saw regionals in the United States where there were some lending issues that popped up in earnings last week. A lot of participants are trying to figure out what's going on and try to explain this choppy move. And I think it's more so just a digestion of a crazy market run. And right now, the market is looking for a second catalyst. We need another reason to gap up and continue the bull run. And it's healthy to see these sorts of digestion periods. And I don't think market participants should be looking in too much or looking too aggressively for negative and or bearish signals at the current moment. There's plenty of things to be concerned about, don't get me wrong. And I know we're going to focus on a few things, but the overarching health of credit markets and the global stock market is still fairly robust. And it's important to remember that we are in the middle of a bull market. This is not a recession at the moment. So keep your wits about you, especially when you're reading all of the bad headlines that tend to dominate. So from there, Mel, I'd like to move into some of those headline risks, some of the government issues that are, I think, plaguing all of our news feeds.
Yeah, well, as you can see, this is a great time, I think, to just move into talking a little bit about government shutdown. So many of you are probably aware of the government shutdown that has gone on in the United States for the past few weeks, I think now. And when the government is shut down, obviously, when you're a huge economy, it does create, or it can create, some uncertainty just in terms of, things are not moving forward. Employees that work for the federal government aren't being paid, all these kinds of things. But one of the things that I encounter so much in the work that I do in Pocket Lobbyist and with clients is we have so many cultural ties with the United States that we can sometimes look at what's happening there and apply it to Canada. And I want to just spend a couple of moments talking about how Canada's system is a little bit different and why we would never actually be in the situation of having a government shutdown like the United States is, so that we can just sort of better understand how those dynamics work. So right now in the United States, there's a government shutdown essentially because there's a dispute between the legislative branch and the executive branch. So Congress and the office of the president, essentially. Essentially, in the United States, when we see a government shutdown, it's because of their strict adherence to what we call separation of powers, meaning that no branch of the government is more powerful than another. This is quite
No
different
kings.
than, yeah, exactly. This is quite different than what we have in Canada, which is not an exact separation of powers between our parliament and the prime minister's office and the rest of the executive branch. And that goes for provincial levels as well. But sort of it's a little bit more of a dance than it is a confrontation. In Canada, a government shutdown is impossible just because any disagreement on supply, which is to say funding of the government, which is important as we come up on a federal budget on November 4th. If there are any disagreements on supply in our Canadian system between the Parliament and Office of the Prime Minister, we essentially go into an election because that's seen as a confidence issue. So I don't want to spend too much time talking about parliamentary and presidential procedure, but I think we look at the markets, we look at the United States being such a huge market and such a driver of markets. I think just understanding some of those top line issues when it comes to how our political systems work are important. So we see that the shutdown's happening in the United States. We have a budget coming up in Canada on November 4th. We do not need to worry about a shutdown in Canada. That's basically all I want to say about that, unless you have any questions, Joel.
No, I think more broadly, I'm paying attention to the narrative war that's going on between the two parties. I think depending on which news you consume, you're blaming one party or the other for the government shutdown of some sorts. And I do want to pinpoint one specific thing that you mentioned, and it's this weird Canadian dynamic where we identify with American politics for some
Mm-hmm.
odd reason,
Mm-hmm.
where we have no kings protests in Canada, which makes little to no sense when we literally do have a king. The
Yeah.
It's odd that we have this attachment, and for me, I feel as though it almost clouds our judgment with how we analyze our own political sphere, and I think it's a net negative for us. Now, back to what you mentioned, for me, and directionally, what I think is more important is actually the narrative war that's being fought. Which who's winning in saying that whose fault is it that the government shut down? And so what I'm paying attention to is, okay, is the current narrative war being won by Donald Trump, or is it being won by the Democrats at the moment? And at the beginning of this shutdown, it really felt as though the Democrats were winning that narrative, where they're like, this is a result of a king who is running. They're currently they have all three levels of government, so this is their fault. When you start to look at the prevailing narrative now, it's very clear that it's shifted the other direction, which to me signals a few things: that there's going to continue to be support for the Republican policy and their direction from the point of view of negotiating tariffs, how that's going to impact markets, and where we're going to head, because they're going to have, perceivably anyways, more power and more leverage going into the midterms. So that's kind of what I'm paying attention to personally. I like to see who's winning the narrative war so that I can make a call on whether or not there's going to be a step function change in how Donald Trump and the Republicans are we'll call it pandering to their electoral base heading into the midterms. So personally, it feels as though the Republicans have gained some ground here, which tells me that they're going to continue to push and pressure the tariff narrative.
Well, it's kind of interesting that you say that, Joel, because if you're asking whose fault is it that the government is shut down in the United States, it's the House of Representatives, it's Congress' fault because they weren't able to pass a spending bill that they could send to the president to either sign or veto. And Congress is dominant, has a majority of Republicans right now. So it
Mhm.
actually is just even more instructive in terms of, if you consider the president to be part of the Republican Party, which he is, but he's in a separate branch of government. It's just interesting to see how those things break down, not only along party lines, but within party lines as well. So yeah, I mean, it's Congress that hasn't been able to pass a spending bill that the president can veto or sign. If the president had a bill before him that he was just refusing to sign or wanted to veto, then could be his fault as well, which is kind of a combination of the two.
What's kind of crazy though is he's showing again how much power he has, where he's able to fund government activity separate of Congress. Like right now, he's using tariff revenues to get stuff done. It's kind of wild to watch what feels it's a new playbook.
It's a
So
new playbook. It's a new playbook. I don't want to get too much into the legalities of all of that because I'm actually not sure what the
he's necessarily allowed to do
yeah,
what he's
like
doing.
I don't know. And I think there's so much before the courts with respect to
Mhm.
how President Trump is running that I don't want to, I'd probably do a little bit more research on that before commenting. But yeah, I mean, I always say this in politics and government, there is a real big difference between like what we think should happen, the should-isms, and what can happen. And in the United States, where the Constitution is sort of like the Constitution is king, essentially. In Canada, we have a bit of a hybrid between our Constitution and parliamentary supremacy. But when Constitution is king, you don't have to like what's happening, but if it's constitutional, it's allowed to happen. And again, I don't actually know if it's constitutional because I think that may have some be open to an interpretation, but I think just in judging like what we don't have to like something for it to be allowed to happen, and we don't have to think it's right or have it even be right for it to happen. So it's an important note on politics for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. So in Canada, I want you to kind of go through where we're at and give me a lay of the land. I need to be updated on what's going on here at home.
Yeah. Yeah, so the last week was a break week following Thanksgiving for Parliament, and they're back this week. There's some focus on definitely affordability and sort of anticipating what's going to happen with the budget on November 4th. There's talk about what's happening around defense in Canada as well. CPI data came out today, which shows that CPI, which consumer price index, and essentially inflation, rose about 2.4% on a year-over-year basis in September, which is up from 1.9% in August. So, Joel, you talk about being in a bull market, not a recession. Who knows what that could be, in the coming weeks and months when it comes to that. I would say that part of the kind of conversation, and we were talking about this last week too, and I know we want to get into talking about critical minerals and gold and all this kind of stuff, but part of Carney's goal with C5 is to advance major nation building projects that are going to kickstart Canada's economy, which I think is, generally a good thing. We talked a little bit about the BC Alberta pipeline last week. Jury's still out on that. We'll have to wait till Grey Cup to get a little bit of a decision on that. But one of the things that I think is so fascinating is we can draw sort of lines on how things are related. And I asked you this morning before we got on, I was like, we need to talk about gold and how gold is impacting the Canadian economy from just like the way that the markets have been working with gold lately, but also just related to how we can really harness and leverage the incredible critical mineral strength that Canada has. So leading up to budget and as well just thinking about some of these major nation building projects, I'm thinking a lot about that in terms of where we're at currently with the Canadian economy and politics.
So right now, it feels as though we've shifted back to tariffs being a very important topic from a Canada perspective. Now, you touched on CPI and the reacceleration from 1.9 to 2.4. I think what's important is that expected CPI came in just 0.1% hotter than what we saw coming. Now, the tariff situation is, I think, is becoming more top of mind due to, well, one, summer's over, they've returned back to Parliament. Donald Trump has, in many regards, reaccelerated that conversation with his most recent tweets and we'll call it headline grabbing comments regarding the Chinese situation. In China specifically, they're going through and laying the groundwork for the next 5-year plan, which is going to be taking place at, I believe, the meeting this week, or is it next week? But nonetheless, it'll outline the CCP plans for the country for the next 5 years, 2026 to 2030. All of this, I think, coming to a head pushes forward the important relationship that Carney is supposed to be structuring here with Canada and the United States. And there's a specific pain point that's becoming increasingly top of mind, not just for Americans, but for, I think, Canadians as well. Today, gold's down like 5.5%, one of the largest moves we've seen, bearish moves we've seen in gold in some time. That brings to, I think, attention just how important mining and minerals are to the Canadian stock market. So today, the US is up 0.7-ish%, while the Canadian TSX, we'll call it TSX 60, whatever, is down, put near 2.5%. Why? Because of just how large a percentage the mining companies, gold mining companies, make up of the TSX index. So, and the Toronto Stock Exchange. So this, to me, is becoming arguably what I think will be the forming factor of our trade negotiation leverage with the United States, because of the leverage that the Chinese have over the US with their rare earths and specifically the 7 heavy minerals that they control 90% of production. And interestingly, there was, I think this is, just 1 second, I'm going to bring up the podcast there was an interview with Gracelyn Bascaran, who is kind of a rare earths expert that works at, I think, CSIS in the United States. And I'm forgetting the name of the acronym, but nonetheless, she is an advisory to the executive branch. She is a very prominent figure. She's been on TV like crazy lately. And she is effectively defining the biggest problem in the American economy, which, interestingly enough, if they were to, let's call it, create or draft policy and get out of their own way, something that they could solve along with their allies. Those allies being Australia, Saudi Arabia, and Canada. Why? Because we are a massive producer of minerals, a whole wide swath of minerals that they, in the United States, sure, they can mine, California being one of those major locations for mining a number of those, like 23 rare earths. The Canadians also provide a ton of that as well. Hilariously, Donald Trump thinks that they don't need us. He's holding our feet to the fire with regards to auto. He's been pressuring us quite significantly. However, we have a number of cards to play here. And if I were to guess, his relationship with us and his trade deal with Canada is less important to his voting base, and him winning against Canada is much less important than him winning against the Chinese. And currently, he's backing off on Xi. It's quite interesting. Taco has come out in full force and backing off because of the incredible leverage that they have with regards to this rare earth problem. So this podcast that I referenced with Gracelyn Bascaran, she calls attention to the pressing problem that is currently plaguing the United States, in that they are going to have a very tough time being tough on the Chinese due to the rare earth issue. Now, again, gold, the Canadian stock market, mining, etc. This all comes back to political policy. It's really funny. When I first got into this industry, I really didn't think that politics would be so important to markets, but my goodness, has it become just so intertwined. Planning for this.
It's so funny that you say that, because I feel like when we were all younger in our early 20s, I was really the only person involved in politics, and it kind of seemed so dumb. And it's hilarious now because everybody is now more senior, and it's like, finally, I had to wait 15 or so years for what I do to be cool to anybody. And I feel like I'm cresting on that point now.
Well, you know what? Good for you for being early.
Yeah, early adopter.
Absolutely. So, you know what? Our mineral sector, our mining sector is going to become increasingly important. I believe that it's an amazing opportunity for us. Now, can we get out of our own way, Mel? What needs to happen for us to utilize the mining expertise, the talent that we have, the exportability, the fact that we have an endless sum of very important minerals with regards to the semiconductor industry, the manufacturing industry of the United States. How do we use this? What is in our way currently, and how do we make use of proper policy and our position?
Yes. So, one of my favorite people to follow on this topic that overlays the economic and policy sphere of critical minerals is Heather Exner-Perot. She is at the MacDonald Laurier Institute, and she's just a brilliant thinker on these topics. And so I really rely a lot on her perspectives. She writes a lot about critical minerals. She's fantastic. I think that there's a few different elements here. So, of course, as you mentioned, we have this strategic opportunity because of our large endowment of critical minerals. Not only is this an economic opportunity, but as you mentioned, a defense opportunity as well, because as we look at the jurisdictions around the world that have this supply that the United States could work with, it really is Canada, Australia, China. And so just sort of recognize how important the fact that we're right beside the United States and have this supply, it's really, I think, an opportunity that we should not sort of let go, I guess, especially when we're looking at supply chain resilience and all of these types of things. I think that when it comes to how to sort of stimulate growth in this area, my understanding is there's kind of we were talking about this before we started recording, but there's kind of two elements to it. There's the sort of regulatory aspect of getting approval to actually start work on a mine. And then there's obviously the heavily energy intensive element of operating a mine. And so it's both a regulatory and legislative issue, but for different reasons, sort of approvals and then emissions. So it's kind of a two-part issue when it comes to that. It's also, as you noted, a very significant part of Canada's economy. I believe it's somewhere around 6 or 7% of our nominal GDP. Also, ironically, a significant part of the economic pie for British Columbia. So when we talk about the overlay of economics and politics, if they can't unlock that, then even just like the pipeline discussions, et cetera, it all becomes very interesting to overlap and discuss. So I think it's a willingness. It has to be a willingness to want to build these projects. But Exner-Perot talks a lot about it's not enough for us to just sort of extract these minerals and then export them to United States. The real unlock for Canada is going to be in our ability to produce value added materials as a result of mining and critical minerals. So lead time to actually being able to develop a mine is pretty significant. I think I don't actually know that this is unique to Canada, but lead times for mines can be anywhere between like 12 and 17 or 18 years from discovery to actually extraction. So obviously that's
very similar in the US now.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I don't know. My point is that I don't know if China can do that much quicker, right? So that's where the dynamic comes in. Is it's like,
so
how long does it take for them?
So this is where I've focused my obsession on over the last week, which does not make me an expert. However, I have been listening to a number of experts talk about the difference in the approach to what I would call the manufacturing industry. Our approach has long been capital first. So we decide if there is a business case at the very beginning. We focus on, okay, is there currently demand? We have a ton of supply in the ground. Is there sufficient demand to justify the economics of this project? Famously, Justin Trudeau said, no business case for natural gas. However, when it comes to defense and a strategy around how do we create economic strength and positioning globally with our assets that we have as a country, it often is a poor decision to make. And this is from a pure capitalist position. This sounds kind of, boy, Joel, you're sounding like a socialist. What are you doing? But truthfully, there are many projects, especially at scale, that require the government to de-risk them. And the Chinese government does a tremendous job doing this. And they began doing this in the 1980s when they decided that rare earths was going to be a pinpoint or pinch point in which they would hone in on and effectively dominate the entire global industry. And they did this by heavily subsidizing and largely running a number of their mining companies at a net loss for decades. And in order to do this, they were effectively flooding markets, cutting, like if you were to, boy, when I first graduated from high school, the price of nickel has since then fallen 60 to 80%.
No wonder you're so successful, Joel. I don't know too many 18-year-olds that are well-versed on the price of nickel.
Well, I mean, you work in the industry, you end up getting to know it. But truthfully, you start to see, and I didn't appreciate this when I was in between, like 25 years old. You don't realize, but these long form, or what I would say is like these long strategies, the fact that the Chinese are able to effectively plan in 50-year increments where we plan on quarter over quarter, and we don't take the same approach. It makes it very challenging for us to compete on, especially projects like these that require enormous scale and unfortunately long run capital plans that don't make a lot of sense at the beginning. So this is a long way of me saying that the Chinese do things very, very, very quickly. However, while their social contract with regards to the way in which they manage their political situation I think sometimes does not incentivize innovation like the American and North American system does. It does, however, foster incredible manufacturing prowess. And this puts the Americans in this difficult position where they've effectively exported a lot of their carbon. That, as a result, has created a weakness when it comes to supply chain management. So now we have this position in markets today where the Chinese have said that they're going to restrict export of rare earth minerals. The Americans, if they, let's say, cut off the export of heavy REEs, which is like 7 minerals out of China, would run out of those minerals by June of next year. This creates this panic function where they're no longer going to be able to manufacture cars and semiconductors. That is a huge problem. So we're coming to a point on all of this. And I think you'd mentioned this, starting all these mines, very challenging. However, Quebec, the Northwest Territories, and BC broadly have mines in place already. And it would actually go a long way for us to just expand and provide perhaps some regulatory clarity so that these mining projects that are already in existence can actually build out a little bit further. And we have assets that can be brought online because they've been shut down due to the, we'll call it, flooding of the market that the Chinese has taken place in. And it would go, and I think this is part of what the United States strategy is likely going to be moving forward. Their policy is going to be, if you are an operating company in the United States and you're buying rare earth minerals for your manufacturing process, you're going to have to buy it from an allied nation, which will then put a floor on pricing and will create a secondary market. So this is a long way of me saying that this is going to become an area of interest, I believe, not just for Americans, but I think for Canadians, due to the fact that we export some incredibly important minerals to the United States for EVs, turbines, magnets, and magnets being the most important. So I'm very interested to continue following this story. 2 weeks ago, I had one of my bigger clients. He reached out and he's like, "Is this rare earth thing a big deal?" And I just kind of like shooed the idea away. And I'm like, and now I'm readdressing it, and I'm realizing just how big of an opportunity it is for Canada, but also just how much this is going to impact the trade negotiation with the United States. So,
and if I could, just before we move on to talk about some other topics, so much of what you said is so important politically as well, because if we are thinking about these issues in terms of just a dichotomy between environment and economics, then of course there's going to be a temptation, if you really care about the environment, not to mention the fact that mines are not the same today as they were, 30 years ago. But if
Mhm.
you're only looking at this in that sort of either or dynamic, you do ignore a lot of those broader, geopolitical influences that are going to have these indirect effects. I'm reading a book right now. It's called The 100-Year Marathon. It's by this guy named Michael Pillsbury. He used to work for the State Department.
Mm.
And the whole thing that he's unpacking and showing is that we are playing checkers while China is playing chess. And it is a political difference between a desire to be a superpower and like separating whatever morality that may have. I'm not saying that's the right thing. I'm just saying when we look at our competition in these areas, when we look at people with whom we are up against in this zone, we have to consider the ways in which how they approach these problems is so fundamentally different. And I'm not saying that, a free and democratic society like Canada and the United States should be taking notes from China on how they do business. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it does nobody any favors to ignore that reality in determining what the best policy path forward is if we do want to be competitive and have a balanced approach. So I think just in terms of how that intersects with politics, it's important for us to understand that mining companies are not just, greedy capitalists that want to like strip away the beautiful mountainsides of our, most amazing environments. Like, I think that would be a pretty narrow way to look at this issue, especially
Mhm.
considering those broader implications. So I'm really happy that you brought that up. And you've actually inspired me to like dive a little bit deeper into critical minerals. I kind of come and go from this one, but it's probably a good time to get back to it.
Yeah, well, I got a couple podcasts for you to listen to, which will make you
Okay,
feel
yeah.
like you're caught up on it. I would also recommend anybody who is somewhat interested in the Chinese American quagmire. I would say you should read China or Breakneck, the China's
Mm,
quest to engineer the future. So this
yeah.
is a more recent release. Dan Wang is doing his rounds on all the podcasts right now, and he was just on Invest Like the Best,
Mm,
and it was a very, very good interview. I think he put it. So this is a guy who was an equity analyst, moved to China in 2017, I believe, and then lived there for 7 years and just recently returned to the United States he released this book, and then I believe now he's advising he's advising now. But the role of the book, I think, in for people that might find this somewhat interesting, I think he explains the differences in the systems really eloquently that would help folks perhaps frame the differences really well, and then the similarities between the two cultures, the Chinese culture and the American or Western culture. And interestingly, he says that the Chinese and the Americans are actually the most, out of all cultures in the world, the most alike. Europeans being very different from Americans and more so than the Chinese are. And I found that to be enlightening a little bit, because I believe that he's probably quite right about it. And folks will often try to have a dogma they'll attach themselves to a dogma in which supports their biases, right?
Yep.
And most folks will say, you know what, Chinese evil, communism, whatever, or whatever, like more strict socialism, however you want to define the Chinese political situation, just be like, it's bad. Dan Wang, who is a Chinese person, talks very closely. I think he walks the line really well in that he speaks, I think, to the things that China does incredibly well, and just how successful their adoption of capitalist practices has been in dragging so many people out of poverty, while also recognizing some of the, we'll call it, negatives that their political system has. And for those that want to have a little bit more of a level-headed take on the Chinese US dynamic, I highly recommend that book. If you want to just start somewhere, just try the podcast. I think that it definitely, for me, forced me to grab the book, and I'm about halfway through it now. But
Amazing.
I did, I highly recommend it for sure. And I also believe, because this is only going to become more important as what seems to be the United States, so long as the Republicans continue to be in power, they are effectively moving away from the rest of the world. And if they really truly are trying to become more self-reliant, or in my estimation, I think they're going to become more, they're going to pull back more towards North America and focus more on their relationships with Mexico and us as Canadians. If they're going to do that, they're going to have to somehow break up with the Chinese. And I think understanding how that might work out is going to be incredibly important for any business operator. Like, how do you not, if you were to go and talk to a business owner in Canada, the lion's share of those folks have some sort of, especially someone who's bringing in goods, the lion's share of those people have relationships with the Chinese in terms of import export. It's almost the percentage of overlap and how much the Chinese touch Canadian business would shock people, I believe. I have a very good friend whose business is importing and exporting goods. He goes to China and finds goods for folks to sell in Canada, and business has been booming for that guy for 25 years. And to talk to him about just how many businesses the Chinese touch in Canada is shocking. And I think that more people would do well to better understand just exactly what that current dynamic looks like right now. And I highly recommend that book.
Love it. Yeah, I'll definitely look into it. And we'll definitely be back to talking about these dynamics in the future. Is there anything else you wanted to touch on before we do a little muni politics here?
I do a little bit. I want to get your rundown on how the Carney Trump, I don't know, how did that play out, and how is the current, because we just had a peace deal, right, in Gaza. I don't know how that's playing out. I have no idea exactly there's a two-step plan there. What was Carney's impact? How is he looking politically from a geopolitical perspective right now, in your opinion, or if you can kind of gauge the situation for me? Because I'm somewhat interested to know where we're standing there and how this is all playing out.
Yeah, so I think if I could sort of break that out into two parts. So when we're talking about the meeting that Carney and Trump had, I don't know if we talked about this on the podcast. I think it was sort of happening 2 weeks ago.
2 weeks ago, yeah.
Yeah. So looking at the meeting that Trump and Carney had, it was, from my perspective, great. Did Carney stick it to Trump and elbows up him? No, but I don't think he should have. I don't think that would have been the right strategic move. In fact, the back and forth that happened between them was so funny. I just have to get into this one story. It was hilarious. I posted it on Instagram, but the whole dynamic was, Carney did this little press conference with Trump in the Oval Office, and they were supposed to have a meeting and talk about trade and Middle East and all of these things, which I'll get to. And the question on the table as we move into the phase of renegotiating CUSMA or USMCA, however you want to call it, the reporters were asking Trump. Trump was talking very favorably about Carney. And they say, well, if you like Carney so much, why don't you want to make a deal with him? He's like, he's a great man, all these things. I've made him very popular, all the things that you expect Trump to say. Reporter says, Trump, why, if Carney's so great, why won't you make a deal with him? And he says, because I want to be a great man too. And I just thought that was hilarious and a perfect emblem of the exchange. Look, I think that Carney is doing a good job on dealing with Trump. My only bone to pick on this topic, as I continue to rail against in the media, is like, this is not the strategy that Carney was elected on. And I think that when we add this like partisan flair, it's like, we have to actually evaluate. I'm more of a conservative, but I'm going to objectively evaluate the job that Carney is doing on this file as being pretty good. And I'm happy with it. And I'm proud as a Canadian to have him. Not that I wouldn't have been proud with another leader, but I'm not embarrassed to have Carney in these negotiations. The issue is that we can't look at politics through the lens of like, well, if the guy that I think is moral and right does it, then it's okay. But if the guy that I don't think is moral and right does it, then it's not okay. And so that's my only thing with the Canada-Trump relationship when it comes to Carney-Trump. When it comes to Carney's impact on the Middle East and sort of geopolitically, this might sound harsh, but like, I don't think that Carney had a big hand in what was going on in the Middle East. It is in Trump's interest to have allied nations there and behind the peace plan that was proposed last week. And it is in the best interest of everybody who wants to see a resolution to the conflict for there to be a united front on that. And the Carney government had said some things at the UN in terms of Palestinian state recognition and all of these other things. And I don't think that that had a big role in what's happening. I frankly don't think that Canada is a big enough player for that to single-handedly make a difference. I think that when you start to see, Canada, the UK, other countries, like, yes, of course, Canada can be part of a puzzle that puts pressure one way or another. Absolutely. But Canada is not like a market maker on Middle East politics in the way that the United
Right.
States
Okay.
is.
Yeah.
So that's my take on it.
That you did a really good job there. I like that framing, the market maker in Middle Eastern politics. I am now having to brush up on what has gone on, and I know that you have endless books on this, and I'm probably going to tap you for this. But I really believe that the Middle East is going to become a very hot area over the next 5 years. And I think, interestingly, this has a lot to do with where the next big data centers are going to be built and where a lot of critical or rare earth minerals are going to be mined. Again, not advice, but I do believe that is a big piece of this puzzle. And that, to me, is where I'm paying some attention, mostly because of those two things. I don't think it's any secret that there's been a lot of traveling to, we'll call it the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, to fundraise for these mega LLMs like OpenAI, Anthropic, etc. And that is largely because they need capital to buy GPUs to build these superclusters. I actually think that part of it is an infrastructure play, and there is no cheaper energy on Earth. And not only that, there's nothing can get built faster than in Saudi Arabia when they choose to. There's not a lot of environmental rigor that goes into how do I put this? I shouldn't even say that that's true. They can get things done faster than we can at home. They have more political control. And as a result of that, I believe it's going to become very, very important to strategically have peace in the region. So we'll see how that plays out.
I would just add to that as well, much in the same way that there are regional and geopolitical considerations for Canada, US, arguably both part of the Western world. There are major geopolitical distinctions in the Middle East, and the Middle East should not be looked at as a monolith. I think that when you see what's happened in the last few years, you have Sunni Muslim countries, which are the majority Muslim countries like the UAE and others, motivated to economically be their best selves, and as well being on perhaps not the same wavelength or perspective as Shia Muslim countries like Iran, for example. And I think that those geopolitics in the Middle East are also very important. And the reason why I should be annoyed at you for bringing up the Middle East without telling me.
Sorry.
I was like, are we even
sorry.
friends? Like, you want me to get canceled? No, I've read a lot about this, and I don't usually like to talk about things that I'm not educated on when it comes to these topics. But I would just say, I think, that's where a lot of the dynamics are coming out in the region, because with the Abraham Accords that happened in Trump's 1.0 presidency, normalization of relations across many Middle Eastern countries has really changed the politics of that region. And the factor of Iran and its proxies through Hezbollah in the north, in Lebanon, and through Hamas has actually created a very different dynamic. It would be incorrect to say that the Middle East is Israel and then all of the other Arab states. It's much more complicated than that.
Okay.
And so I should probably just leave it there. But yeah.
No, I do appreciate, and you're directionally, you always point me, you kind of readjust my North Star, and I really appreciate that about you. So I didn't want to put you in a position in which you're going to say something wrong. I just think that the area, the region, well, of course it's been important. I believe it's going to become increasingly important, similar to how it was very important during the Bush Senior Clinton era. So it'll be, I think, fascinating to watch, and very important to become more and more educated on it as a market participant, somebody who's advising folks. I think anybody who's at least politically interested should do their very best to read up on the region and better understand it, because I think it's going to become more increasingly important. So let's finish off with some muni politics. I'm not in town, but it sounds like Andrew Knack's going to win.
Yeah, looks like this is the thing, is I hesitate on the Edmonton side of things because we are only seeing 58 of 236 polls reporting, which is only 24.6%. But yes, right now, Andrew Knack is leading with 37.47% of the vote. So I'm hopeful that we'll get a little bit more information. He's followed by Tim Cartmell, which has 29% of the vote, and Michael Walters with 11% of the vote. Interestingly enough, Raheem Jaffer only has about 4.5% of the vote, which he was kind of like a big name that came into this race as well. So we'll see what happens on the Edmonton side of things as well as for council. But at the time of recording, and I guess we should note that we're 11 a.m. Mountain on October 21st for those that are listening to it later. But sort of unofficial results show in Calgary that Jeremy Farkas is going to narrowly pull ahead of Sonia Sharp to be the next mayor in Calgary. And I'm talking like 26.1% for Farkas and 26% for Sharp. So incredibly close, like incredibly close. We will have a recount. And by the time this podcast comes out, I'm sure that the recount will already have been done. But the recounts are often automatic when it's this close. But there's also sort of an element of like calculating through a preliminary recount through the Local Authorities Election Act. If there's a certain amount of rejected ballots or whatnot, that could kind of like create enough doubt for there to be another recount. I am not thinking, unless we have like some massive amount of ballots that are rejected or something that create an issue, I'm not thinking that the result will change too much, but that's where we sit now. And we don't have full results. Like I constantly am refreshing because councillor results, because we are doing, or I shouldn't say we, it's the hardworking election workers are doing hand counts because electronic tabulators have been banned, and that created some additional registration barriers for voters, and as well that just the extra time it takes to count by hand, which hasn't been done since 2017. So lots of love and respect for those election workers. I guess the only thing I would say when it comes to broadly speaking about these municipal elections is that the mayor obviously sets the tone and direction and is the city's representative, but they are just one vote on council. So council elections will actually be really important. If you, for example, wanted to see blanket rezoning repealed in Calgary, you do need to have a majority of people on council who want to repeal that. It's not just because, if it's Mayor Sharp or Mayor Gondek, it's not just because that mayor wants to do it that it can happen. So that's the one thing I would say on municipal elections, but probably leave it there until we know more.
Yeah, my understanding of municipal elections is weak. I'm not going to lie. So
yeah,
I'm lucky to have some friend groups that keep me up to date. And then
last thing before I let you go, my fiance Brock, and you're one of your best friends. It's so funny. I actually want to like put a camera on Brock when I take him into polling stations because he's so shocked by the lack of technology that's involved in our voting system, which it's actually so funny. Like I just want to put a GoPro on him and the looks that he was giving me, like, we're just going to put it in this box. Like it's pretty funny. And I was pretty entertained by it. He was not entertained by me having the television on until 12:30 in the morning in our bed. But that's the life that he chose.
Yes, he did ask, so it's his fault.
Yep, exactly.
It is picturing him sliding a piece of paper into a box with a hole cut out is honestly, it made my day because he's just like, this is so silly.
You're not allowed to take photos and videos inside of a polling booth, otherwise I would have. But yeah, it was 10 out of 10. Anyway.
Oh man, so good. Well, Mel, thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to chatting with you in a couple weeks.
Yeah, see you in a couple weeks. Safe travels.
That's all for today. Thanks for listening. If you found this valuable, please subscribe and share it with a friend. As always, the information on this podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered financial and/or tax advice. Please consult a licensed professional for your own personal situation. Joel is a registered portfolio manager and investment advisor, and clients of his and his firm may own securities discussed on this podcast.